main two-pronged argument is this. The Mavericks had 1 star to other teams 2 or 3. The Rockets had 2 stars to the other teams 1 or 2. So they get an advantage there. The 6th seed on paper is a little bit of fool's gold, but they get credit, definitely get credit for going through the 1, 2, 3 seed in the West and the 1 seed in the East. 100%, right? The ultimate argument where I think this boils down, besides Mavericks only having 1 star, is that the 3 series, right, the semifinals, the conference finals, and the finals for the Mavs, that premium of crop that they played in a much more condensed talent and championship winning teams that they played, and beating those teams with only 1 star and guys who had never won before, I think is more impressive than perhaps it's still you could say as impressive, but their competition's a little more spread out. That's ultimately what I think the difference is.
Deep in the heart of Texas.
We're in the business of winning.
Don't bet against me.
I don't bet anyway.
Lose your life.
All right, everybody. I wanted to do a bit of a follow-up to the debate, just because more content for you guys. And I'm finding that when I do these debates, I kind of want to put a bow on it somehow, you know what I mean? Like some closure. And I think it's just more content, and as long as the topic's good, I think it's relevant and it's good content anyways for you guys, and that's what we're here to do, right? But like in the Johnny Manziel versus Vince Young debate, I was I don't want to say I was sour, but I just I was just so into the topic, and I honestly think that, and I'm in such a minority, right, that I really dive deep into it. This one, not so much, and also the Randy Moss and Terrell Owens debate, I don't really feel so strongly about either. Same thing with this one. These are 2 of the greatest finals runs ever, right? So there's nothing to be upset about either way, but I just like doing these to put a bow on it, get some closure, move on, get another video out of it. And so I just kind of wanted to do that. Also I think is because, I prepare for the debates, and then the debate happens, and then there's some commentary afterwards. And so just some other things get brought up or what have you, and it's just a way to kind of get that out of the system, right? So I'll start with the Rockets. In my opinion, the year before was actually more impressive than their repeat. That's just my 2 cents. Having only 1 superstar, 1 MVP, 1 guy lead a lot of young rookies. Essentially, everyone on that team was a rookie or their first or second year, and he went through. I would say largely the same amount of competition, still had to beat the Suns. They fell down 0-2 against the Suns. They lost 2 games at home to the Suns, and they go back and beat the Suns, right? I think that's really impressive. They played Portland, who was kind of struggling at the time, but they still had Clyde Drexler. They were a decent team, right? So the first round, maybe not so much. And then they go and they play Utah, and they just spank Utah, I think, in 5 games in the Western Conference Finals. And then they go 7 against the Knicks, who, at this time, this was as good as the Knicks got. And, him and Patrick Ewing had a battle. And just, one guy leading a team, I think, is just really impressive. And the way they, a lot of, youth is nice, but youth in the playoffs is not always what it's cracked up to be. And Akeem really took those guys and was a really good leader in '94. I just think the way they won and the sort of him being the only superstar, that's just my 2 cents. I just think it was more impressive overall. But we'll get on to '95, right? So one point that Ian brought up, which is very true, is technically Houston played the toughest seeding possible, a 1, 2, 3 seed in the West, and then the 1 seed in the East. Like that is pretty impressive. Nothing you can really say about that or to bash that or anything. Again, my only point with the Rockets is, I guess for me, it's hard to be considered a 6 seed or an underdog or like have it be a so-called impressive run whenever you're the defending champion and you pick up another top 50 all-time player, an all-star, a Hall of Famer in Clyde Drexler 2/3 of the way through the season, and your roster gets better, and then you sort of begin to play like you should at the right time, right? I just feel, to me, it's just my personal opinion, right? To me, like that's just, it's not, it sort of tarnishes that 6 seed look on paper, right? Like, oh my God, a 6 seed, that's incredible, right? Yes and no. Like, yes, it's incredible that they went through the 1, 2, 3 seed in the West and then the 1 seed in the East. There's no way you can bash that or say they didn't prove it or that they left any doubts, right? Definitely not. And again, these are 2 of the greatest finals runs ever. And one thing I kind of hate is like when it's like such a tight debate or conversation like this, it's like you have to kind of make your case, right? And it's like if you say something like, well, Barkley, Malone, and Stockton never won a ring, right? And then people will be like, oh, so you think Barkley sucks? And it's like, no, I'm just like, I have to make my case here, right? And the both of the runs were incredible. These are probably 2 of the top 5 to 10 runs of all time, correct? So like, I just want to get that out of the way. It's like, I'm not saying Robinson sucks. I'm not saying Shaquille wasn't good. I'm not saying Malone and Stockton weren't like championship-worthy players or teams, right? But we're trying to edge each other out here in a debate, and I have to make my case, right? So like, no, Barkley didn't suck. Robinson wasn't a scrub, etc. But I have to argue for my side, right? And so what they did going through the 1, 2, 3 seed and the 1 in the East, I mean, that was it. Like I said, it left no doubt, right? It leaves no doubts. There's nothing you can say about that. My only thing, I guess, is that, again, like I said, it's hard to be surprising or like to shock people when you won the year before and then your roster got better and you picked up another all-star and a Hall of Famer. And, you sort of begin, I don't want to say they caught lightning in a bottle because I think that sort of implies they were lucky. I think they just got hot at the right time, right? I think they just kind of figured it out at the right time. I think Akeem's one of those guys who's really built for the playoffs kind of thing. His stamina, his athleticism, he kind of does it all. You throw in Clyde. I guess to me, like, they don't come off like a traditional 6 seed, right? I know on paper they're a 6 seed, but to me, like, if you know how good that team was, which, again, I'm kind of giving them credit here and sort of saying how great they were, like, it's not shocking to me that they won, right? I think that they were struggling during the regular season. It hurt their seeding a little bit. And so, like, when you kind of go back and look at it, people are like, oh, my God, a 6 seed won. That's incredible. Yes and no, right? Yes and no is kind of what I'm saying with that. Also, another point that Ian brought up was, like, the total games that they won, which I think he said was the most all time, and I definitely believe that. I think the total wins for the Mavs was, like, 15 games less or something, 15 to 18 games less than what, in terms of how many total games their opponents had won. But again, if we remove that Portland series and we take away the lowest win total from the Rockets, which was actually the Orlando Magic, we're talking about a difference on average of like 3 wins per team, right? It's just, anyone who follows NBA, right? Like a couple wins here or there, like there's, one more shot here and there, and Portland would have won 5 more games. Or, the seed, you go down or you move, 1 to 3 spots in seeding, right? So, like, while, yes, that's impressive, again, it's impressive. They went through the hardest possible route you could go through. It's sort of like, is it really like that big of an X factor or that big of a point? In my opinion, no, not really. But again, that's, I can't say anything about that, right? That's just my opinion, and I can't really say anything about that. So that's that. That was just my point on the seeding and the win totals and things like that. And then I also mentioned how they got Clyde Drexler. So half of this debate, or if we're going to look at like either half of the debate, right? Half of the debate, in my opinion, is who you played against, who you went through, right? And you focus a lot on that. But one thing I kept trying to bring up, and I think it's really important, the other half of that is who was on your team, correct? And I think that when it comes to how good each other's teams were, that the 95 Rockets definitely had more star power. I think that, the role players, you could say it's a toss-up. I think, it's kind of, do you want the youthful energy, with two great veteran leaders and Akeem and Clyde, which is a good mix, right? Or do you take a team that's almost full of savvy vets with really Chandler was the only guy who wasn't an old-timer for the most part, and J.J. Barea kind of being a spark plug here and there. But, it's kind of like you just kind of have to pick and choose which one, and the production overall was largely the same. Now, getting into that, right? Again, I think that's a big point that people are not so much, we didn't so much focus on, but I think that's important, right? One of the things that makes the Mavs run so incredible is having one superstar. I'm being consistent. I think that's why the 94 run by the Rockets is more impressive than the 95 run. Again, the 6th seed on paper I think is a little bit of fool's gold when you think about how they got Clyde, right? And Clyde was averaging like 20, 22 points while he was there, and in the playoffs, that's a lot, for a second guy to consistently be giving you that kind of production. That's why I think the 94 run by the Rockets by Akeem is more impressive. Again, there are two great runs by Akeem both years, but I think the 94 run's more impressive. I really do. You're talking about one guy essentially leading a bunch of youngsters and just mowing through people. Like, that's impressive. To me, that is much more incredible than the 95 run, right? That's just my opinion. And to stay consistent, that's why I think Dirk's run is more impressive than the 95 Rockets, or just that team in general. One All-Star, I wouldn't even call Dirk a superstar. That's another thing, right? I would say Akeem and Clyde were still much more in their prime, right? Akeem was coming off an MVP season, and Dirk hadn't won an MVP in 5 years. That he won his one 5 years ago. He maybe had become more efficient. Maybe Dirk had a little bit overall of a better game, maybe a little smarter, a little wiser. So I think that's the other half of this debate, that yes, it's important to look at who he played, but again, to be consistent, right? That 94 run with one superstar, and again, we're talking about a guy who won an MVP that year. He was at his absolute peak, arguably, for the most part. That's more impressive to me than the next year where it's two superstars, two stars, two all-stars, and they then like put it together and repeat, right? That's why I think Dirk's run in 2011, again, nobody there had won a ring on that team. Rick Carlisle was the only guy with a ring, technically, right? No one had won a ring. A couple guys had been to a finals, I guess 3 finals between, I guess Terry too. So Terry and Dirk had been to a finals. Kid had been to 2 finals. I think that's it. I can't remember if maybe Brendan Haywood went to a finals or 2 with the Lakers. 3 guys on the Mavs who had even sniffed a ring in terms of going to the finals, versus everyone on the Rockets had won a ring the year before. Akeem had already been to a finals and lost as well. So he had, kind of him and Dirk have really similar careers in terms of like the story arc in a way. But yeah, I just think that's the other half of this debate, is 2 superstars and all-stars is not as impressive to me as one all-star. One superstar leading a team and putting them on his back and winning a ring against teams that have multiple All-Stars, right? And getting onto that, right? Now we'll get a little bit more into like who they played. This argument's very close. I know we went again, you got to kind of go tit for tat to make your point, but this one is very close. Like when you break it down, if we look at guys who were in their prime, had won rings or would go on to win rings or won MVPs or would go on to win MVPs, all NBAs, all-stars, stuff like that, right? It's very close. It's really neck and neck. But I would like to make this argument, and I think perhaps there's not really a lot of denying this. In the time of the 90s, right, you did not really have such things as super teams, or there really was not teams who had multiple stars and all-stars for the most part, right? Yes, it happened every so often, but it wasn't a thing like the 2000s. And one thing that I also noticed about the preseason odds that I didn't quite notice before is that in the 2010-2011 preseason odds, Dallas actually comes in at number 6 in terms of the preseason odds at plus 2,000. But yet when you look at the 94-95 preseason odds, to get to number 2,000, you have to go all the way down to number 14 with the Miami Heat. Again, this just sort of further illustrates my point that in 2010 and 2011, the talent in the competition was much more stacked at the top than compared to 94 and 95 in terms of the sort of super team angle that I'm trying to get at. And I wanted to add one more thing here because we had sort of mentioned the playoff lines or the betting odds for the series or for the 2 years we discussed. The Houston Rockets were slight underdogs in every series that they played in 95. Not by a lot, but they were, technically. The Mavs were underdogs in 2 of the series that they played, and they were slight favorites in 2 of the other ones, the other 2. The only caveat being that preseason, the Mavs were massive underdogs, plus 2,000 to the Rockets, plus 450. The Rockets were tied for second, just behind the Phoenix Suns for odds to win the championship that year. The Mavs have the second all-time preseason odds in terms of winning it, in terms of being the biggest underdog, second all-time. Also, the Mavs were bigger underdogs going into the finals against the Heat, and in terms of the biggest upset, it would be the Mavs pulling off the upset against the Lakers, who they swept. So just kind of comparing the betting odds and how they looked and how they compared and how they stacked up and what they actually did. You look at a team like LA, right? So Hakeem plays a one-star team essentially in terms of Charles Barkley and the Suns. He plays a one-star team in terms of David Robinson and the Spurs. And even when he played the Magic, right, a very young team. I mean, their best players were 2 and 3 years into the league, respectively. And, you know, that does mean something. Again, they got there. But I also think that was such a great matchup for the Rockets. You're talking about Hakeem, who played the same position as their best player, but had the experience, had the better game at the time, the better skill set, still had the better skill set even once they retired. You know, Shaq, you could maybe argue, was more dominant at his peak, but Hakeem definitely has a better skill set than Shaq. There's no denying that. And you have kind of Clyde, Kenny Smith, Sam Cassell versus Penny Hardaway. You know, I think it was just such a bad matchup for the Magic, right? Again, that's just sort of my basketball opinion. You know, at the end of the day, either you win or you lose, and they got swept, right? So that's just what it is. But you know, there really was not, and then you played the Jazz in a 5-game series. Remember, 5-game series, that matters for something. And they had 2 stars, right? So you give them that one, and the Magic had 2 stars, and you give them that one, right? But in terms of looking at what the Mavs went through, right? Again, that Portland round sort of hurts them, sort of hurts their argument a little bit. But you go and you look at who they played the second round. Two All-Stars, and you have a lot of good role players, Bynum, Odom, Meta World Peace. Again, I'm not going to count those guys, but they had 2 All-Stars, a 2010 guy in Gasol and an all-star, and obviously the great Kobe Bryant. And they had just gone back-to-back. They were still, largely in their prime still. Maybe Kobe had lost half a step, but he was still Kobe. So they played 2 stars there. They played 2 stars in Oklahoma City. Kevin Durant would go on to be MVP 3 years later. LeBron would win the next 2, and then Durant would win an MVP as well. Westbrook would then win an MVP. You had Ibaka and Bynum again. I'm sorry, you had Ibaka and Harden as well, right? I know Harden was not Harden, but he still was chipping in 14, 15 points on 56% shooting or something like that, playing 32 minutes, right? He was still a force. He still was good. And Durant was leading the league in scoring that year. He was all NBA. They would go to the finals the next year. That was a point I forgot to bring up, right? They would go to the finals the next year and lose to the Heat team with Ray Allen. I believe Ray Allen was added the next year. So they beat, again, another 2-star team. They then go to Miami, and they had 3 stars, right? And, again, it's just sort of insurmountable to think in like on paper that one guy who's sort of slightly just peaked, right, just on the downhill side of his career, would beat 3 guys who were still largely in their prime, right? Especially Wade and LeBron. A guy who, LeBron won an MVP the 2 years prior, I believe. Kobe won it the 3 years ago, the 2 years, 2 years LeBron before that, and then Kobe before that. Dwayne Wade had won a ring in 2006. Chris Bosh was a force in his own right. I mean, Chris Bosh played better than LeBron, right, in that finals, or maybe even for the playoffs. That's kind of where I think I kind of mentioned this in the debate. If you average out like who they played against, Houston probably gets a slight edge in terms of the average team, but that's only because of that Portland series. And I think going through 3 teams that are, I would argue, were sort of tougher, more talented, and had guys who had done more overall. And I don't really think there's any arguing that when you look at the fact that, that Oklahoma City team had a guy who would win an MVP 3 years later. Durant was an all-NBA guy that year. He led the league in scoring. He would go to the finals the next year with that same team. So, again, that was a championship-level team. He then beats the 2-time defending champions with Kobe and Gasol. They then beat the 3-star team and the Heat, who would go on to win the next 2 championships. And LeBron would win, I believe, the next 2 MVPs, and then Durant after him. I think that crop of premium talent is more impressive than the sort of more spread out average that the Rockets beat. I know it's by slim margins, right? Again, this does not mean I think Barkley sucks or that Malone and Stockton are scrubs, right? I just think that that Portland series hurts the Mavs argument. But if we remove that and we only look at the 3 rounds after that, I think that premium that Dirk went through and beat with the Mavericks is more impressive than the gauntlet of the 4 series that the Rockets beat. Also, remember, keeping in mind it's just Dirk, 1 star, and the Rockets always had 2 stars to the other team's 1 or 2 stars to the other team's 2 stars, right? In Utah and Orlando, they had essentially 2 stars to 2 stars, 2 Hall of Famers to 2 Hall of Famers. I know Penny's not a Hall of Famer, but he was balling out at the time. His numbers were really good. And I just think, right, the Portland series kind of over an average hurts the Mavs, but if you remove that series and you just look at the last 3 rounds the Mavs played, I think that is more impressive in terms of that ultimate top-tier crop of guys that they beat than Houston, who had 2 stars, versus everyone else's 1 or 2 stars. And Dirk was a 1 star going up against teams with 2 or 3 stars, right? I think that when you put it in that light, I think that is more impressive, correct? That's kind of my 2 cents on the argument, just my summary. It just makes me feel better to rant, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But I just wanted to, like, again, what the Rockets did was incredible, right? Going 3-2-1-1 in terms of the seeds is, like, I can't knock that, right? I'm not knocking that. It was incredible, right? But also to look at who they played. Barkley would never win a ring. Utah would get 2 shots at it, and they would never win a ring. David Robinson won an MVP that year. He would then go on to win in 99 whenever Tim Duncan got there, correct? 99 was the lockout year. Remember that. Tim Duncan, again, I'm sure Robinson was good, but Duncan won the finals MVP. He led the playoffs in rebounds. He led the playoffs in win shares. Avery Johnson led the playoffs with assists. So again, like, David Robinson, whenever he finally did get his ring, he was not the main guy, right? Not even close. So David Robinson only averaged 16 and 10 in 99, which is decent numbers, right? But not David Robinson 1995 numbers, right? And in the playoffs, he averaged about the same. So again, Barkley never won. He won an MVP the year before Akeem in 94, so give him that. Malone would go on to win an MVP in 97 and 99, so I'll give him that. Again, David Robinson won it in 95. I'll give him that. Shaq, I think it's a little bit too much of a spread. He didn't really hit his stride until 2000 in terms of, like, his ultimate dominance and winning, and he did it with Kobe Bryant. I think that's a little too stretched out a little bit to go 5 years afterwards. I think a 3-year window is fair for the most part. I'm not going to really count James Harden. I don't think that's necessarily fair. But I think counting Durant, Westbrook, LeBron, Wade, Bosh, and even LaMarcus Aldridge in a way, people forget about him, and Paul Gasol, I think is more than fair to, like, look at what they either did or would do in the 3 years before and after, which I think is largely also what I'm doing with the Rockets when we look at, Barkley, Malone, Robinson that year, and I'll even give Robinson the ring, although I kind of went over why that's not all it's cracked up to be. My main two-pronged argument is this. The Mavericks had 1 star to other teams' 2 or 3. The Rockets had 2 stars to the other team's 1 or 2. So they get an advantage there. The 6th seed on paper is a little bit of fool's gold, but they get credit, definitely get credit for going through the 1, 2, 3 seed in the West and the 1 seed in the East. 100%, right? The ultimate argument where I think this boils down, besides Mavericks only having 1 star, is that the 3 series, right, the semifinals, the conference finals, and the finals for the Mavs, that premium of crop that they played in a much more condensed talent and championship winning teams that they played, and beating those teams with only 1 star and guys who had never won before, I think is more impressive than perhaps it's still you could say as impressive, but their competition's a little more spread out. That's ultimately what I think the difference is. And so that's essentially my video. I just want to get on and rant and vent. And again, these are 2 of the top 10 finals ever. I went and looked up the biggest preseason odds of teams to become champions. I think another thing to note is the Mavs hold the 2nd all-time preseason championship odds in terms of being an underdog and winning at plus 2,000. The Rockets that year, going into 95, were tied for 2nd best odds to win it at plus 450, right? The Mavs are almost 4 to 5 times bigger underdogs than what the Rockets were going into the season, right? So that's why I don't think the Rockets should get double extra credit and cookies on top or whatever for struggling and then playing as they should, right? That I'm giving credit to them. I thought they should have won. Like, I think they should have won. Like, and they did, right? Like, I think they were the best team, especially after getting Drexler. So like that's just why I think, you know, you look at kind of what they did, and if we're going to talk about surprising people, right? Which one was a better finals run in terms of being an upset and surprising people? I just think the Mavs came from way further back to win their finals than the Rockets, who started out in front, fell behind, and then they went back up and won it, right? I don't think that's as surprising, right? I think people are kind of waiting for them. They knew they could do it, right? No one thought the Mavs could do it. And that's also a big difference too. So that's my video. I think I got another one coming out here in a little bit as well. So, but that's my video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.